Today we're going to talk about an alternate way to make bias binding called a continuous bias binding strip. This method starts out with a square of fabric that you cut and stitch together and then cut one long roll of bias binding. The first time I tried this, I used a square that was much bigger than I needed, which I was very happy about because I had a lot of binding that was not usable. The second time was better. By the third time I had it down pat. It may take a little practice for you to get this method down pat. Hopefully, the tips and the information that are included in this video will make your journey a little smoother than mine was. To begin, we're going to walk through the steps for making continuous bias binding. We'll start with a square face down, put a pin in the bottom, a pin in the top, so you know which sides you're going to want to sew together, and cut from the lower right to the upper left corner. I'm going to flip this piece up, I'll put this piece on top of it face down. I'm going to offset it about 1/4 of an inch because I'm working with triangles, and stitch those together using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. After that's stitched, you're going to press that seam open. Every instruction I've ever seen at this point says to mark the back of your fabric with lines that are the width of the binding strips that you want. I do not mark my fabric at this stage. If you're going to cut with scissors, you would need to do that. I use a rotary cutter, and not having to try to line those marks up later makes the whole process much faster and much easier for me. So I have my fabric face up, and I'm going to turn the points in. Then I'm going to cut a strip that is the width of my binding strip in several inches from this side. I'm going to offset my points by 1 row, pin this seam together, stitch, press it open, and that's going to give me a tube of fabric that I'm then going to cut into one long binding strip. I introduced you to my favorite easy reference tool in our first video, so I'm just going to look up how big of a square of fabric I need to make the amount of binding I need. So for example, if I needed 260 inches of binding at 2 1/4 inches, I would need a 29-inch square of fabric. I've cut a 29-inch square of fabric. However, to share that with you at this point, I would have to hang my camera off the ceiling. So I'm going to demonstrate this part on a much smaller piece of fabric. I have my fabric square. I'm going to turn it upside down. I'm going to just put a pin in the top and the bottom of my fabric so I don't get confused about which sides of my triangle I want to stitch together. And I'm going to cut it from the lower right to the upper left corner. When I've cut my square into triangles, I'm going to flip one triangle up and set the other triangle on top. Since I'm sewing triangles, I want to offset by a 1/4 inch. Then I will pin that side and sew a 1/4 inch seam. A couple of tips before we get started sewing. If your seams start oddly, a stiletto is a great tool to prevent that. You'll see me using it a lot. I love these pens. They are super fine size and they have a glass head. So for one thing, I can iron over them, and because they're super fine, they'll bend. So my needle, they'll go out of the way of my needle if I fail to take one out. And I also don't get a lot of distortion from my pens and my fabric. If you started out garment sewing, you learn to pin from the outside in. For quilting, you want to pin from the inside out. We're sewing very narrow seams, and pinning in this direction, you can see how flat the edge of my fabric is laying. So it gives me a much straighter seam with a whole lot less effort. A little about stitch plates. This is a standard stitch plate. It has a long opening, so I can sew straight stitches, I can sew zigzag stitches, decorative stitches, whatever I want with it. The problem with this stitch plate when we're quilting is this long opening sometimes eats the ends of our fabric when we start sewing, especially if we're sewing triangles. This is a straight stitch plate. It has just a single small hole for my needle, so I don't have to worry about the end of my fabric getting pushed down into that hole and eaten by my machine. So I'm just going to snap that in place. If you forget to change this back out to your standard stitch plate and you decide to sew a zigzag, it will snap your needle. Don't ask me how I know. I've measured my stitch plate, so I know that between the middle of this hole and this line down the middle of my feed dogs and this line on my stitch plate is exactly 1/4 inch. So I know where I want to line up the edge of my fabric to get a good seam. You can tell, perhaps you can tell, perhaps you can see this, the middle of this hole, when I put my fabric right on my 1/4 inch seam, the middle of that hole lines up with right where the point of this triangle and the side of this triangle are going to cross. I've set my stitches to secure at the beginning and the end, and I'm just going to use my stiletto right there, right in line where I want my needle to be, so I get a perfect start on that seam. Flip my needle out, and we are off to the races. So the pieces of my large square stitched together, and I have pieces of my small square stitched together. You can see that my seams are beginning and ending at just the right spot. I don't have any puckering. It's all nice and smooth, perfect 1/4 inch seam. When I first started quilting, It was so bad. I didn't know about pinning to the outside, and you have different stitch placements, and the marks mean something, and use a stiletto, and everything was so difficult. As I've picked those tips up over time, quilting it's fun, it's easy, it's enjoyable, and I hope those tips will help make quilting a true joy for you the way it did for me. I've sewn this seam and opened out. Now, everywhere that I've read says at this point to mark lines on your fabric the width of the binding strips that you want to make. Then turn it and pin these two sides together and sew. It is almost impossible for me to pin these sides together, offset by one on this angle, sew and open them out to a straight line. So I don't mark the back of my piece. I just do the pin part. And I'll show you that on the big piece. On my big piece, I have sewn that seam together, pressed it open, turned my fabric right side up, and folded my points in. On the side that's closest to me, I have cut in the width of my binding strip and at least 5 inches. So I have this strip started. Because that strip's already cut, where I pin this piece together with the other side is going to be offset the width of one row of binding. I'm just going to start pinning gently. We're on the bias, about 1/4 of an inch. Tab sticking out on my edge. And here we go. I like to cut my strip using a rotary cutter. If you cut using scissors, you're going to need to draw the lines and then do this step. I find that no matter how gently I mark, I wind up with some stretching and some distortion. And then when I'm trying to pin and join this seam, the lines coming across this side and across this side need to match up perfectly. Once I have opened that seam out, and that never goes well for me. So this is much faster, and I wind up with much nicer binding. Once I've pinned to this side, you're going to see that I have a chunk of fabric left on one side because I've cut the width of a binding strip off of the other side to make it offset by 1. So I'm all pinned and I'm ready to sew this seam together. I have my roll of fabric. I'm going to slip a mat in between. I've marked my ruler with the width that I want to make my binding strip. And I'm just going to roll my fabric down on it. Set my ruler in place. And cut. I already have some strip cut because I was filming and my camera turned itself off, and I'm not sure when and where, so I'm not sure what y'all caught and what you didn't. This is my exact steps. Just continuing to go around the circle. And cut my tube into a binding strip. And that's all there is to it. I am down to the point where I don't have enough left to cut the width of the strip. So I'm just going to snip that last little bit away. And I have a big pile of bias binding ready to double and finish the edge of my quilt.